all of you were able to fit your cars in our driveway this morning. I was a little worried on Wednesday when half of our entrance was gone, but here we are. And my name's Lincoln. Many of you might know me, and if you were at society meeting, you know me as the person that cuts the grass, probably. And here I am this morning doing something I don't usually do, so bear with me. But I'm excited to talk about the book of Ruth this morning. I've been away this past month in May because I was helping my family with seeding. I grew up farming in Saskatchewan, and we were seeding, and I sat in the tractor going around and around, back and forth across the field, and I thought, what a perfect opportunity to listen to some of those books of the Bible that I have not read in a very long time, and some books that I haven't even heard other people talk about for a long time. Eventually, I found myself listening to the book of Judges. If you're familiar with the book, you may not be surprised when I say that this is when I started to worry that I might have made a mistake in my listening choices. It's tragedy. Stories full of blood, violence, and the abuse of power seem to mark every chapter and story. Meanwhile, God's name is used and abused, even acting to further the plight of the most vulnerable people in society. After stories of leaders who fail repeatedly, the book only goes on to tell of a civil war, detailing how women were especially vulnerable due to what Israel had become. The author expresses that Israel had become like Canaan. They forgot about the justice of Yahweh and adopted many pagan practices and practices of their neighbors. They adopted practices of mutilating captive kings. They took up the Canaanite worldview and began bribing God with human sacrifice, treating leadership like business contracts, acting for revenge rather than deliverance, and stockpiling gold and riches from their wars to increase their security under the godless understanding that might makes right. An understanding that displays just how far that they had become removed from their loving and redeeming God. Personal vengeance and a philosophy of conquering neighbors took the stage and were praised. The Israelites, who God had called to be a nation marked by their generosity, hospitality, and a worldview rooted in the abundance of Sabbath, had completely and utterly failed. The narrator of this tragedy diagnoses Israel's corruption, saying that the Israelites did not remember the Lord their God who had rescued them. The Israelites did not remember the Lord their God who had rescued them. They didn't remember the God who opposed their enslavement to the Egyptians and who redeemed them. The God who liberated them from their oppressors by revealing himself to Moses in the burning bush, empowering him with a heart that hated the ways of Pharaoh and loved the ways of Yahweh. They did not remember the Lord their God who rescued them, not only from the hands of Egypt, but also from becoming like Egypt. The Lord who led them into the wilderness and provided manna, instructed against stockpiling wealth and against coveting power. The Lord who instructed against becoming like Egypt and against becoming like Canaan. Forgetting their Redeemer, God's covenant people, who were supposed to be a blessing for all the nations, became undecipherable from the nations they were supposed to redeem. Doesn't sound like your average day driving in a tractor. This is what I'm listening to. And I felt disturbed and discouraged. I was trying to rectify in my own mind, where is the God who redeems in this story? Where is the Redeemer? How is it that God is actively redeeming the world? I mean, if God promised to redeem the world through the nation that forgot that they had been redeemed in the first place, then where is God's grace, mercy, justice? Where is God's love for humanity and his redeeming action? Despite reading the Bible for years and becoming familiar with many of these stories, I genuinely felt deflated in the process of revisiting these stories. Should I switch mics? Closer to the mouth? I genuinely felt deflated in the process of revisiting these dark stories. And I hope that you also feel free to be uncomfortable with these stories. How's that? Is that any better? Okay. Luckily, as I listened on and entered the book of Ruth, a voice appeared that was plagued by some similar questions. Questions that arose from this period where a redemptive God may have seemed like a far-fetched idea. It doesn't appear in Ruth that we're out of tragedy, unfortunately. In fact, Ruth begins with the words, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land," purposefully kind of tying you back and not letting you forget that story that we just heard of Israel's utter failure. And then we meet a woman named Naomi, who lived during this time when women were increasingly vulnerable in society, in this society that had forgotten the redeeming ways of their God. The tragedy remains and it thickens. Naomi, whose name means the sweet one, is an Israelite that is struck by famine, becomes an immigrant, and is then widowed after having 2 sons. And then her 2 sons also die in this land that is not her home, and they leave behind their Moabite wives as widows too. There's a scholar named Marian Ann Taylor who describes this very short introduction to the book as the road to unbearable emptiness, where Naomi renders herself and anyone who accompanies her to be hopeless. She lacks experiences of redemption and begins to ask, what does it mean that God is our Redeemer? Now today, I don't want to talk or ask the story within the book of Ruth to answer questions regarding why people suffer. I don't know the answer to this, nor do I suspect that Naomi or Ruth feel that they know the answer. Many scholars compare Naomi to Job, who asked the question until God revealed to him that it was not the most fitting question for him to know. So I'm not convinced that we're bound to understand why there is suffering in our world, but I do believe we are never alone in our suffering since Jesus suffered on the cross. But today, I want to explore Naomi's question. What does it mean that God is our Redeemer? I think that the book of Ruth speaks directly to this question. Now, this question doesn't really seem worth asking for the generation that walks out of Egypt and through the Red Sea. Generations that could see God liberating and reclaiming people and nations for goodness, for the love of their neighbors, and for God. It is easy to proclaim that God is my Redeemer when tragedy is not your story and redemption is visible and tangible all around you. But let's turn to the story of Ruth, where this question had to be raised. It had to be raised in this time when the judges ruled. The elderly widow, Naomi, after telling her daughters-in-law to leave her side so that they can still have hope, is met with pushback. One of her daughters-in-law, Ruth, clings to Naomi, embraces her hopeless cry, and says, "Do not worry, or do not press me to leave you, to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Unable to convince Ruth to leave her, Naomi continues to Bethlehem, accompanied by her Moabite daughter-in-law. And there she asks people to stop calling her Naomi, sweet one, and to start calling her Mara, which means bitter one, because she perceives that God has dealt bitterly with her. Where is the God who redeems? Where is the God who redeems? And then suddenly the story takes a turn. The author of Ruth notes that their arrival in Bethlehem was at the time of the barley harvest. And no, this isn't just a detail that should only stand out if you're listening from a tractor, though that can help. No, the barley harvest is the time of the Passover, when God liberated Israel from slavery. This author's note acts as a hyperlink to the first instance where Yahweh is associated with redeeming, and where Yahweh is first called the Redeemer. In Hebrew, it is the word Ga'al, which we will come back to as it enters our story today, and as it wasn't in our story in Judges. Now Ruth, the Moabite, is the mic still working? Sorry. It's fine? Okay. Now Ruth, the Moabite outsider, decides to go and glean some wheat in hopes of being welcomed by someone who can protect her. Who can protect her and Naomi from going hungry, being unsheltered, from being sold into ancient forms of slavery, which would happen to people that would trickle to the very bottom of society. She just so happens to find herself in the field of one of Naomi's relatives, Boaz. And Boaz, as we heard in our reading, welcomes her, keeps her safe, and offers her nourishment. He commends the Moabite for caring for the widow, and he even compares her to Abraham, since she left her native land to follow Yahweh and act rightly by her neighbor, Naomi. Finally, Boaz blesses her and prays that she finds refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. Unlike the judges, Boaz remembers the Lord their God as a refuge for those who are in need. When Naomi hears that Ruth met Boaz, she becomes ecstatic. There's another big shift, maybe bigger than the barley harvest. She begins to talk about God in a different way. From saying, "He has dealt bitterly with me," to "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." And she doesn't take back or lessen her suffering, but she does start to be able to identify God's kindness through the action of others. Naomi celebrates because Boaz is their family's redeemer. The word Ga'al appears again, the same word that we saw in Exodus. And this refers to something that was commonplace in Israel's culture, where a family that is devastated by death, famine, or other causes, and that these things lead them to be unable to upkeep their family's property, inheritance, they kind of have two things that can happen. Either they lose everything and trickle to the bottom, or a wealthy and generous relative can buy it back and preserve that inheritance for the vulnerable family members that are at risk of losing everything. This family relative is called the family's Ga'al, the Redeemer, the family's Redeemer. So Naomi is celebrating. Boaz goes on to prove that he is an upstanding person who loves Yahweh and who is interested in redeeming the plight of the vulnerable rather than taking advantage of people by using his wealth and his power. Boaz says to Ruth that he will give her refuge under his wings and redeem her and Naomi's family through his generosity, even though she is a Moabite and a widow, which wouldn't have exactly been a reputation boost in ancient Israel, as we learn from the other family redeemer that said, "No, thank you." Naomi is no longer hopeless and empty. And the family is redeemed from extreme poverty and vulnerability. And the two widows receive security in the midst of the time when the judges ruled. They're redeemed. That's a quick abridged version of the book of Ruth, but the question still remains, what does this story say about what it means that God is our Redeemer? Now, some might actually be tempted to say, I'm not sure this story says anything about God being our Redeemer. God did not step in like he did when he split the Red Sea. He did not step in and overtake the wicked judges, reestablish a just and loving society, and deal sweetly with Naomi from the very beginning. Someone might say God did not respond to the plight of the vulnerable, and that is why Ruth had to, and that is why Boaz had to. But I would suggest and ask, what if the redeeming actions of Ruth and Boaz are intentionally indecipherable from and intertwined with the redeeming work of God? I'll say it again because Jacob wants me to go long. What if the redeeming actions of Ruth and Boaz are intentionally indecipherable from and intertwined with the redeeming work of God? Ruth, by making Yahweh her God and remembering God as a redeemer, accompanies the brokenhearted where there is not hope, supports the elderly and the vulnerable, and clings to those who are in need, rather than clinging to the pursuit of individual security and turning away from others who are in need. And Boaz acts out of compassion and generosity, offering shelter for the poor and the immigrant, just as he hoped that God would provide, the God who offers shelter and poor for the immigrant. Both of their actions are directly compared to the actions of Yahweh, who provides refuge. Scholar Marianne Taylor suggests that this story enacts a theology of divine and human cooperation, as those who pray for God's blessings participate in answering their petitions as well as the prayers of others. To know the divine as Redeemer means to participate in divine redemption. Maybe this resonates with how you have felt God at work in your own life. Like for Naomi, God sometimes acts in redeeming ways through other people, not always through miraculous and instant healing, but through partnership with agents of God's redemption. It's not that God either acts or his people act. Ruth tells us that for God to be our Redeemer means that we participate in his redemptive work. Ruth and Boaz are examples of redeemers who know their Redeemer. This week, at our Young Adults Bible study, we looked at the book of Mark and a story in chapter 3, where Jesus is sitting in a circle with a crowd that is listening to his every word. People are all gathered around him, and he says to them that those who do God's will are his true kindred, his true family. Those who participate in God's will. He doesn't say that those who pray on the street corners and ignore the hungry, or those who keep the Sabbath but ignore the sick, not those who claim to know God while hating the foreigner and the refugee. Those closest to Jesus are the ones who participate in God's redemptive mission. To know the just God is to act justly. To know God as the God who sees each person and desires that all of creation is redeemed is to further become an agent of redemption in the lives around us. I'll call the worship team to come forward. Now back to the book of Judges. This book that details the tragic failures of Israel. He says that they did not remember God as the God who rescued them. They did not remember that the Lord their God is for the redemption of all things. So they began, you could say, to make God in their image, to serve their own ambitions, their politics, to serve their choice of people at the expense of God's beloved, all people, all creation. And after reading that book, Ruth is very strategically and in a way that feels, and certainly felt to me, relievingly placed right after Judges. And it teaches us that God is indeed the Redeemer, and we are called to be participants in this redemption. Redeemers who remember their Redeemer. Redeemers who remember the Lord their God, who cares for the widow, who cares for the refugee and the foreigner, who cares for you and for your neighbor, for those in this room and for those that are outside of this room that you'll meet today. We are invited and we are empowered to be participants in the redemptive work of this unstoppable God that is at work redeeming all of creation. So let's worship him now.